So we're recording. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to today's session. We are going to begin by going straight into the guide. We're going to be reading chapter 1, going straight into chapter 1. And last week we talked about in detail how to look at the guide within the context of a more traditional way of looking at Judaism. And today we're going to be reading chapter 1 or parts of chapter 1, but we're also going to be thinking in that way of the context. Where's Maimonides coming from? Not just looking at his work as a standalone work, but what is he responding to? What's his context? Because we're studying him not as philosophers only, but we're studying him as congregational. So I'm going to put up on the screen. How many of you have an actual copy of the guide? Okay.
I do.
Great.
I don't have mine with me today.
Okay, no worries. I'm going to put up on the screen so we can all look at it. I've just got to go back to the beginning.
Rabbi, if you can just give page numbers too, because mine's much easier to read from mine.
Okay. So we are page 21.
Okay.
Chapter 1. And I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to be going slowly because we want to break it down, but also have a lot of other sources that we're going to share. So again, for the last few weeks, we've been really talking about context. There was one session we talked about the commentaries on the guide, and we'll be revisiting one of those commentaries at the end. Spent a lot of time talking about how the secrets of the guide and how Maimonides was trying to obscure what he was doing or not. But now today we're actually going to get into it and actually read the guide itself. So Alan, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. Open ye the gates, that the righteous nation that keepeth faithfulness may enter in. Chapter 1. Image, Selem, and likeness, Demuth. People have thought that in the Hebrew language, image denotes the shape and configuration of a thing. This supposition led them to the pure doctrine of the corporeality of God on account of his saying, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." For they thought that God has a man's form. I mean his shape and configuration.
Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So what is Maimonides responding to? What's the question? What's the problem?
What does God look like?
Anthropomorphic God.
Say that again?
It's just the what is the real definition of image?
Right. What is the definition? What is the definition of image? And what's he responding to? Right. Somebody else had something to say.
I said it refers to an anthropomorphic God, and we want to get away from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would go a little farther and say it more generally to God who's corporeal, who has a body, and then more specifically, you might say what sort of body. But if you first attack the question of whether God is corporeal, has a body, then you can maybe address it on that level. And it sure looks like it when we begin with, "Let us make man in our image." So that's what he's dealing with, I think.
Yeah, beautiful. And so he says this supposition led them. Who is them?
People in general?
People, yeah.
Okay. People, and his contemporaries, right? We're talking about the Jews of the time. We're talking about maybe beyond the Jewish world, and maybe even talking about his fellow rabbis who don't have the same views as he does. Let's read a little bit more, and then we're going to get into that them. Who is that them?
Perhaps the redactor of the Bible.
Perhaps
Maybe it's the common folk.
that's a big comment. Yeah.
Maybe it's the common folk for whom this guide is written,
Mhm.
right? It's the, not the elite, but maybe it's the common folk that he's addressing.
Well, it's unclear if he meant this guide for the common folk. He seems to, on the face of it, meant the guide for the elite, but he may also be while he's doing that, responding to the common folk.
But the elite would necessarily the elite see the divine in a corporeal form? I mean, isn't that kind of what makes them elite, that they don't need?
So you see, there's a very big question, which is what was the general thinking at the time? Where was human civilization? Where was Judaism, and where were his peers as well? And what is he trying to do? So we're going to.
Well, that pure, where it says pure doctrine, I think kind of lends to
elite.
the difference between, yeah.
It sounds like there's actually a doctrine. It's not just, common belief on the street, but there's actually a doctrine of people who believe that God has a shape. So we're going to actually look at some other of his commentaries, contemporaries, and see what they say about this.
Well, don't we have a history in the Middle East of idol worship, and then which had a human configuration, if you will, of God, and then when the Abrahamic philosophy, if you will, I guess, took over, it sort of carried over into the milieu of the culture of the Middle East, and so assumptions such as the definition of the image were carried down generation to generation without thought to any other kind of outside influences like Greek philosophy, for example.
Beautiful, right? You all have to do is read the Torah, and you see that it seems like the other people had very concrete ideas of what God was, because they had all these idols which were in specific shape. And all one has to do is also go back to our history lessons at school, and the Greek gods had shapes, right? The Near Eastern gods had shapes, and they made statues in those shapes, and that was at least an ancient way of looking at God. And maybe by the time of the Middle Ages that had evolved, but how far had that evolved? And that's, what is the context of Maimonides' thinking? On one hand, he is working from within Islamic society. Islamic society believes in a pure monotheism, right? You can't have any image of God in Islam or image of the prophet. But in Catholicism, right, they have images of the saints. They have icons everywhere.
Well, isn't it easier for the uneducated, kind of ordinary person to have a sense of something greater if there's something that they can actually look at, touch, or feel, or grasp, rather than some notion or idea that's floating out there? I mean, if you have like an idol or some way to wrap your head around it, that that there's this God that's greater than you have, to be able to
yeah, it's hard to connect to something which is totally unlike what we experience, right? That's really hard.
Yeah, or something ethereal. You can't grab, you can't wrap your head around it.
I mean, I've said this many times, we dress our Torah around and kiss it as it comes around, right? We dress it in jewelry, and then we parade it around and kiss it. And when you talk to many modern Jews, and when we come to times in our life where we re-examine our theology and what we believe. And for some people, and there's no problem with that, but it's a lot of people, the last time they really thought, well, what is God, might have been back when they were very young, even pre-bar mitzvah age, and they, grandfatherly image in the sky, right? Might be, even though people would probably instinctively say that's not what I believe, but that might be the last time they had a conversation about it. So it's and it's easier, when I try to talk about God to my kids, it's complicated, and they're like, well, where is God? And what does it mean that God is inside? And all those questions. It's harder to grasp. I really hear what you're saying, but it's interesting because Maimonides is responding perhaps to that reality on the street, what people are thinking, but what he is talking, as has been mentioned, about a pure doctrine, right? So that means he's saying that there are other people who believe a doctrine of God having some kind of shape. So let's jump into the commentators. Would someone like to read for us Radak? So Radak David Kimchi from France, and he's coming only a few years after Maimonides, right? Maimonides dies, 1204, 1205. So he's coming 30 years after Maimonides. David Kimchi is in the area of the south of France, the Narbonne area, which I've mentioned before, which the area where I grew up, but it's close to Spain, and it's got that mix of both Ashkenazic and Sephardic culture, and a lot of philosophers. But David Kimchi is known for his commentaries on the Torah, and he's philosophically minded, but he's also traditional. So somebody like to read for us B'Tselmeinu Kedmutenu in our image and our form. Go ahead.
B'Tselmeinu Kedmutenu, according to the interpretation of my father of blessed memory, the meaning of the word B'Tselmono applies both to a physical likeness as well as to a spiritual likeness. The expression Tselem and Dmut, respectively, are sometimes applied to something physical, and on other occasions applied to something abstract, spiritual. The word Tselem is an attribute sometimes applied to a physical entity, such as in Samuel 1, Pasuk 6:5, Tzilmei Tchorechem, images of your hemorrhoids, or in Numbers 33:52, Tzilmei Maschotem, their molten images. The same expression is also used to describe something spiritual, as in verse 27 of our chapter here.
So we don't have to go into the rest of it, but he's just doing what commentators do, which is proving his point. But I think the first sentence is saying his father, who's a very famous rabbi at that time, says the inner image also applies to a physical likeness. So there's obviously rabbis in this period, leaders who believe that God is in some sense has a physical, human beings have a physical likeness to God, which is pretty astounding, right? Might not be what we believe. So we're going to go down a little bit. We're going to go to Ramban, Nachmanides. Ramban, in many ways, is responding often to Rambam, Maimonides, Nachmanides, and he's living a generation or two after him. And Ramban is known as a Kabbalist, while Maimonides is known as a philosopher, obviously. But in the end, they actually do end up in many similar places. But this is again on that verse of Selem Elohim, that God says, "Let us make him after our likeness." So this is what Ramban has to say on the same idea, just to give us a sense of what is this other doctrines around at the time. What is Maimonides responding to? Michael, do you mind reading this one too?
No problem. The meaning of Tselem is as the word Toar, as in V'Tselem, and the appearance of his face was changed, Daniel 3:19. Similarly, surely B'Tselem, as a mere appearance man walketh, Psalms 39:7. When thou arousest thyself, Tsalmam, their appearance, thou wilt despise. Same 73:20. That is, the appearance of their countenance. And the meaning of the word Dmut is similarity in form and deed, as things that are akin in a certain manner are called similar to each other. Thus man is similar both to the lower and higher beings in appearance and honor, as it is written, and thou hast crowned him with glory and honor. Psalms 8:6, meaning that the goal before him is wisdom, knowledge, and skill of deed, Ecclesiastes 2:21. In real likeness, his body thus compares to the earth, while his soul is similar to the higher beings. So
Ramban, right? Ramban he doesn't quite go to what Radak says, which is God has a physical shape, but he seems to be, it's there somewhere. And he's saying in real likeness, the body is like the earth, while the soul is similar to the higher beings. So he seems to not be going quite as far as Radak, though he does say that Selim and Demut are talking also about appearance. So
Rabbi,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't fully understand the last sentence when he says likeness, his body thus compares to the earth, while his soul is similar to the higher beings. Is he comparing the earth to creation here, somehow to Genesis, that the body somehow compares to the earth as a creation of God, and then the soul being distinguished because of tiers of beings? Is that where his thought comes from? I can't quite figure out the source of that, what that sentence is supposed to mean.
So
I think he's just saying the body and the earth are both physical while the soul isn't.
exactly, that's what he's saying. He's saying that the image, right? God made the whole world. So he's saying that part of man is like the earth, is physical, and part of man is like the soul, like the higher beings. So that's what he's saying, and yeah.
Okay.
He's working that dichotomy of soul, physicality and matter, and soul and spirit. So I'm going to stop sharing here. We're going to go back to our text itself. So he is obviously working from within a world that does believe, even there's doctrines that God has some kind of shape and form. It's not, and so he is addressing the common folk, but he's also addressing existing beliefs about what God. He's going to talk more about this now, and it's quite interesting. Okay, would somebody else like to start reading the pure doctrine?
I will. The pure doctrine of the corporeality of God was a necessary consequence to be accepted by them. They accordingly believed in it and deemed that if they abandoned this belief, they would give the lie to the biblical text, that they would even make the deity to be nothing at all unless they thought that God was a body provided with a face and a hand, like them in shape and configuration.
Let's just stop for a second. Why were they in this conundrum? Why did they have to believe this?
Because that's the plain meaning, one might say, of the biblical text, and that it makes it appear that God has, in some places at least, it seems that he has a body, and if we give a lie to the biblical text, and then we have to then treat many things as figurative, we're starting to wonder if the text can be relied upon.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering myself, why couldn't it be metaphorical?
So really good question. But once you start saying that statements which on the face of it seem to be straightforward and metaphorical, then you can start to wonder about a lot of things, which is, as Phil was saying, if everything is a metaphor, then where do you end up? Right? And they believe the Torah was perfect and God's perfect word. And if you start to question it, then you get yourself into a problem that affects your whole way of looking at life and religion, and everything was interconnected.
In that connection, I gathered from the introduction. The introduction by, I think it was Strauss's introduction, or it could have been in the translators, that the whole the note that in the translation into Aramaic, the one that was so popular by Onkelos, which is, you still find it in some in Chumash sometimes, in Orthodox shul, is I didn't realize till I read there that Onkelos takes pains to translate by avoiding as much as he can the concrete physical representation, and treat everything, if not as a metaphor, then as some kind of figurative language, which I had not realized, and I haven't tried to read it. And so that was here was an ancient text that translated, but was already deeply uncomfortable with the plain text.
Beautiful, right? Exactly. He was already working within. Onkelos is already several thousand years after this appears, and he's already or 1,500 years, or but Onkelos is already uncomfortable with these ideas because presumably in his society things have already evolved, and he's reflecting his beliefs while reading the texts. And it's one of the most interesting things about Maimonides in general, what I was talking about last week, which is how you have certain figures within Judaism who are looking at the text from their point of view and who have broad enough shoulders to gently steer things in a different way. I caught somebody else. Somebody else was about to make a comment.
Didn't in the beginning or the preface to this chapter 1, didn't he talk about how in order to be able to reach people, you really have to talk in parables? Because if you tell them the truth, they won't really understand it.
Yeah, exactly.
So in Genesis, they talk about God being or man being made in the image of God. Again, if that's a parable, then we just have to define, what does that really mean?
Right. Exactly. We have to define what that really means, but we have to do so in a way that's cautious because of how precious that is to us. Right. That idea that we're made in the image of God is a very important idea. I mean, in our days, it's taken on so much new meaning. Right. We have to treat all other people with respect and honor because everybody is in the image of God. So it's actually a very important idea, as it was to them, and so as you were saying, the part of Maimonides' basic ideas is that everything is working on multiple levels.
Is it possible that the image of God is an inverted thing? In fact, rather than saying that man is made as you take something from God and you make man, what about if you think of that in the image of God, that God, through God's imagination, man is made. That's also being made in the image of God and says nothing about God except that he made this image.
Beautiful.
I mean, I've often read it like that man is made in the image of God. Of course, God made man. God created man out of an image that God had, and he created man with that image. Is there anything in the reading of this in Hebrew that would rule that out?
Well, if we're not going to read the whole chapter.
No. I just mean the image thing. Let us make man in our image after our likeness.
But that's where Maimonides is going to go, and where actually a lot of the others don't always agree, is that the idea for image is abstract. It's not to do with shape. It's not to do with physical form. So it would work well with that idea of an abstract, an image in that sense. And it is interesting to think that of course human beings, we can't ever know what God is, and I think pretty much all branches of Judaism would agree on that. But we each have an image of God, just like God is an image of us. But we each come to an image of God that's completely individual. Really, each person has their own unique vision of what God is, even though we can touch on the truth of God. Let's continue, because I just want to go forward with this idea, because we'll see that the people he's talking about, it's a subtle difference. He's not saying they believe that God looks like you or me walking around. It's a little bit more complicated. So Deb, do you mind continuing? However,
he is, in their view, bigger and more resplendent than they themselves, and the matter of which he is composed is not flesh and blood. As they see it, this is as far as one can go in establishing the separateness of God from other things. Now, with respect to that which ought to be said in order to refute the doctrine of the corporeality of God and to establish his real unity, which can have no true reality unless one disproves his corporeality, you shall know the demonstration of all of this from this treatise.
Okay.
However,
let's stop there. So right, he's saying that those other people, and they're not saying God is made of flesh and blood, but it's a more subtle argument. You know, I can almost imagine he's arguing here with Radak, or Radak's father, or the other people around him who are believing. You know, they're not saying God has flesh and blood. They're just saying God has some kind of shape. God has some. If not, why would the Bible be saying, let us make him in his image, which means that we must share some kind of image with God. So why is this important for Maimonides? Why is it so important that God has no shape whatsoever?
If I may, he says that, and I must say, I draw on the introduction by the translator as well on this to understand this sentence. Without establishing, or by Strauss, without establishing that God is not corporeal, you can't go on, the argument is, to establish that God is one, that God has unity. You have to start with, because once you have, and this I'm a little less clear on, once you have a corporeal God, which doesn't necessarily mean flesh and blood, but once you have a corporeal God, it's hard to see why God is one rather than many things, as all bodies have parts and so on. You get quickly into a philosophical questions that are very uncomfortable. And you need that first. So that's more important to him than establishing a monotheistic doctrine. Right. I think
it's the most important foundation for him of it all. And if it was so important, we can imagine that it wasn't necessarily shared by all of his peers and by the others he's responding to. But it's very important to him. Clearly, this is the foundation. I mean, it's the beginning of this chapter, and much of the chapters coming after this all deal with this idea. It's very important to him, and he goes to great length using traditional methods of interpretation, and we're not going to read through all of it, but comparing tselem and demut and different forms, trying to prove within the Hebrew text that the words for image is not a word that's used in other places of the Bible for an actual physical thing, though when you read the other commentators, you see they say no, it is. So he's trying to make a really strong point that it cannot be in any way referring to something physical. Now,
go
ahead.
Once you establish that God is corporeal and has some kind of form, then you have a limit. Then you have a limiting God, and how can God be everywhere if that's the case? But on the other hand, when we talk about God limiting himself or reducing himself to make place for the universe, that would also imply that God is corporeal and has a limiting shape.
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea of God reducing himself to make room for the universe is a Kabbalistic idea, which comes much later from Isaac Luria. But the Kabbalists our response to Maimonides, for whom it's so important that God has no form. And the Kabbalah says, God has no form, but God also, before you reach that level where God has no form, God kind of has a form. So the Kabbalists are responding to Maimonides' pure doctrine, which also has its problems, because Maimonides' pure doctrine suddenly takes away from the literalness of the biblical text and gives you very little to connect to, right? Well, when we're talking about how do you connect to this Maimonidean God? That's, for Maimonides, it's not a problem because he's up there, right? But for everybody else, it creates a little bit more of a problem.
Not necessarily, though, because if there's a corporeal God, then you can make a graven image of a corporeal God. So by proving that there is no corporeal God, then we are somehow validating the commandment, right? You will have no other gods before me. You shall make no graven images. How can you command not to make any graven images if God is corporeal? It's a whole lot easier to follow that commandment if you're not thinking of the divine in a corporeal way. Then you're not tempted to make a graven image because there's no corporeal form.
very interestingly, there's a lot of discussion then about that and about the first two commandments, not to make a graven image and how it applies to God having no form. And then you can get really, you can spend months in the weeds of that, because it's at this point in time in the Middle Ages, that's a really big debate and important thing. And so it did allow for much pure monotheism. If you have God has absolutely no shape. But it obviously wasn't as much of a problem for Maimonides' contemporaries, because they believed God had a shape, and they still said Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? They still said God is one. And so maybe it meant something a little bit different for them, and we don't quite realize the effect of Maimonides' thought in shifting the very stream of how our tradition understands God. So we're going to take a one step back and then move forward. I just wanted to bring that verse from Genesis, which says this. Someone like to read for a God made wild beasts of every kind.
And cattle of every kind and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. And God saw that this was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth.
So it's nice to bring the context, because the context is in the context of a verse talking about God, about human beings' dominion over the natural world, right? In the image is something about our image is what gives us, is connected to our dominion over the earth, over the animals, our unique position in nature. And then we have Rashi, right? Rashi just gives you most of the time the pshat, the simple meaning, in our image, in our type, after our likeness, with the power to comprehend and to discern. And we see Rashi, Rashi is kind of giving you a snapshot of tradition up to then. So he doesn't have the same problem as Maimonides. If Maimonides was writing here, Maimonides would say, not our actual image. But Rashi doesn't say that. He doesn't say like our actual image. He's kind of in between somewhere. He says in our type. So Rashi doesn't have the same big issue. He's not trying to do what Maimonides is doing, which is really important. We'll have the Zohar. We'll get to it later, because the Zohar has a different idea of what image is. For the Zohar, image is all the Sifirot and God's mystical shape.
Rabbi?
Yeah, go ahead.
Going back to the first commentary.
Radak.
The one above Rashi.
This is just
I'm sorry, it wasn't the commentary, it was the quote from
itself.
Genesis.
Yeah.
I'm kind of keep looking at, let us make man in our image,
Yes. Yeah.
after our likeness.
Yes.
And this is God, and there's only supposed to be one God.
It's like the royalty that kings use.
So that's one way of looking at it. That's a whole class in itself. And the commentaries, so Maimonides is most concerned about image. All of Maimonides' contemporaries, they're more concerned about let us make man in our image. That's what they spend ink worrying about, because like, whoa, what does that mean?
This is in Genesis a few times, right? God going from singular to plural, and it's not super consistent, right?
It's not consistent, and it sounds like God has a whole bunch of people up there, and we're all in the same image. And there's endless. We can spend a whole class, maybe at some point we will, but I don't want to get lost too much in that question. But I will, as Herb was saying, some will say it's like the royal we. Some will say, well, God has all the angels up there, and parts of man are like the angels in the sense, and parts of man are more like beasts. And there's a whole long.
Can I just ask a quick question without opening up the whole thing? Are the different authors, do any of them like more consistently use our versus I?
You're saying that in looking at through the biblical criticism?
In
translation?
The
you mean like
Torah itself, the different.
You're talking about J.E.
Yeah, the letter people.
Yeah. So they sure, there are some. There are two stories of creation. We're not going to get too much into it, but two stories of creation. And so later biblical criticism, right? Biblical criticism doesn't is, right, this great innovation was that they believe that the Torah was not written by God, right? It's scholars who said this, but the Torah was written by different sources. And so you have two stories of creation because there are two different sources that were brought together.
And this is the first one. This is the first
one.
story. Yeah.
This is the first one. And in the second one, which we'll actually get to a little bit today, man is talked about first. And then you don't have the whole story of the creation of the world in the same way. So it's you have two different versions and different names for God, which is why you have the source J and the source E, because you have one where the word different names for God, and a lot of people, a lot of scholars believe they refer to stories coming out of the northern kingdom and stories coming out of the southern kingdom. But we could get really lost in there, so we're not going to go further than that. But I do think I haven't studied this chapter that closely with that particular issue with that lens. But I do think that that idea of us lends itself more to one of the sources, and that I believe is the E source, but I'm not sure. So let's go forward before we get lost in there. So I want to go back to this idea of God having a shape and God being one, which is, right, as Phil was saying, this is really a foundational belief for Maimonides that he's really going back to again and again, in which he puts a lot of effort in to dispel any doubt. So if you wanted to find comments on that, you'd go to Shema Yisrael, right? Hero is the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And I want to show you how ideas had evolved at that point already, because we have Sephorno coming 300 years, 3 to 400 years after Maimonides, an Italian commentator and a philosopher. And we'll see how he interprets that the God is one. Someone like to read that for us?
Shem Echad, seeing that he created all phenomena in this universe, celestial or terrestrial, out of a total void, it is logically impossible for there to be another phenomenon representing an existence independent of him. It also makes him basically different, unique, for all things created by him are by definition potentially terminal, transient existences. He is absolutely unique in the world, based on 4 basic raw materials: water, earth, air, or water, fire, earth, air. This idea appears to be hinted at in the letter Dalet equals 4. I guess that's what that means here. In the word Echad.
Right, the Dalet,
Aleph, Beis, Gimel,
Dalet is big, right? The Dalet in that verse in every Torah is big. So it's
I see. Is that what you're saying? I see. Which is written larger than usual. Sorry. And the letter, I'm having a hard time with the signs. It's letter Ayin in the word Shema, which is also written in larger than normal script, suggesting that we should use our eyes to take note of these concepts, the quote testimony aid that this is so. This is why our sages said that we must draw out the word echad, and you're supposed to draw it out on the last syllable, which is really hard since it's a stop consonant, and I never understood that, when reciting it, so as to give us time to reflect on the full meaning of the verse.
So, right, Sforno is really interpreting it in the way Maimonides would, right? At the time Maimonides, if you look at the other commentaries in Echad, I didn't bring them, none of the others say this, because they're not thinking in this way. But by the time of Sforno, who's becomes one of the most important commentators later, Maimonides' view of the unity of God, meaning that God can't have any shape and God is everything, has become already a central part of Judaism. It's become believed pretty much by everybody, even though there are other parts where Maimonides says that they're not quite as comfortable. But so what is he saying? Right? If everything is God, all phenomena in the universe, everything completely was created by God, then you can't have anything else that's made by God. So everything is united because God made it all. It makes God different, completely different than everything, right? Because God made something out of the void, out of nothing. So everything else this is again what Maimonides said, right? Everything else is other than God. God is other than the world, and everything else is one. So how could God have any shape of that? And everything created by him is terminal, everything is transient. He is absolutely unique. Right, God doesn't have any shape, God has one. So it becomes part of our tradition of when you say echad, and a little bit after Sforno, you have the Shulchan Aruch, which becomes our definitive code of Jewish law, which says something like this. It's a little bit more mystical, but says that when you say the word echad, and you're supposed to make the d longer, which is hard, but you do it one to say that you're saying the word echad and not acher. Acher means other. But it's kind of almost to say God is everything. God is the unity. So this idea of God as unity, which we teach now, might not have been quite as seen in the same way back in the 1200s. It was seen slightly different. God had some kind of shape. God had some kind of likeness, as Radak's father says. Maimonides is a huge voice in bringing us forward, bringing it forward. Now, why is this so important to Maimonides? We're going to now skip to the end of this chapter because the rest of the chapter is really him going through a whole here. Actually, we can read these last few sentences. This last sentence, however, here in this chapter, only an indication is given with a view of elucidating the meaning of image and likeness. So he's going to go into a whole long spiel about why image and likeness proves his point. It's in many ways it's traditional parshanut, but with a philosophical nature. He's a traditional commentary. But at the end of the chapter, he tells us why this is so important. Here we go. Can somebody read for us the last sentence? It was because of this something.
It was because of this something, I mean because of the divine intellect conjoined with man, that it is said of the latter, that he is in the image of God and in his likeness, not that God, may he be exalted, is a body and possesses a shape.
So he doesn't want image of God to mean that God has a body or shape, but what does he want image of God to mean?
It's hard to, he explains it I think at the end of the paragraph that we passed by, where he says that it is the intellectual apprehension. Somehow the specific form, the image, is not an image like a likeness of a physical thing, but it is the intellectual capacity or apprehension. And that is let us make man our image, is giving him reason in a way. It gets very complicated in the next chapter where he tries to explain the fall that way.
Exactly.
But you know, the details of this are not unimportant. The details of this particular chapter, at least in my opinion, are sort of a preamble to Maimonides explaining or trying to explain a lot of the deeper mysteries. And what he's trying to do in this chapter is he's trying to introduce to the reader fine distinctions in thought. He's trying to introduce to the reader a fine distinction between image and form. And he's going to then define what image is, but he's going to play with image and form. Now, if you spend a lot of time thinking about image and form, what's going to happen is you're going to sharpen your intellect. And what he's up to with this is he's up to people being able to change their intellect from what he calls a potential intellect to an actual intellect. Mm-hmm. And the details of how he does this is to follow specifically his argument. So if we don't follow his argument, if we don't read the thing in detail, if we don't read it until we understand it, we get nothing from this except what we sort of throw into it, which we already know.
Go ahead. So I love that idea that within the study of the book itself is like a spiritual practice which brings you.
Well, it's an intellectual practice which leads to a spiritual endpoint. It leads to a spiritual endpoint. It depends what you want to do with this. If you want to select things that you know already, then you do that.
Yeah.
Or do you try and understand his logic? His logic is difficult to understand, but worth trying to do, at least in my opinion. So it means that this particular first chapter, he's also, by the way, talking about the throne, which he mentions 2 or 3 things in this chapter, which refer exactly to Ezekiel's image. The issue of the throne, the issue of the creatures, those 2 things. He mentions things that are very, very important for what he says in the introduction he's going to be up to. He's going to be trying to explain to you, to the degree that you can get it, what is Ezekiel's image actually means. And in this first chapter, if we were to read it carefully, there are lots of clues thrown in here as to what Ezekiel's image means. He does a lot of things at once. One of the things he's doing is what the rabbi says. He's trying to show you that God is not a physical image, okay? But that's not his main issue. People know that already, okay? People who he's writing this book for know that already. Like we all know that. There's nobody here that thinks that God looks like a man, okay? There's nobody here sitting here right now that thinks that God looks like a man. So that's not news to us. What's news to us is his using his logic in this particular chapter to begin to show us things about Ezekiel's image, specifically in this chapter, because there are many mentions of it here.
So I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, David. And you know, I don't, that's not where I'm taking this in some ways. I mean, I appreciate one could get into all the details of the secrets and the Ezekiel and all the sub stuff that's going on in here. In my mind, in some ways, what I'm more interested in is setting the stage for his ideas about prophecy, which we'll get to eventually. And what I find most interesting about this stuff is Maimonides working within the tradition, within the context of tradition of Judaism, to come up with it. Because for me, at least, Maimonides' philosophical ideas, I don't connect to them fully. I think they're interesting. I think that they bring something, but I find myself often in the weeds, and I'm not sure many of us have that same way of Maimonides as connecting intellectually, spiritually, in the way you're saying. And it's not the only thing happening in the book, because we're saying he's responding to the people with the pure doctrine. And to me, the more basic fundamental idea that he ends with, which is so important throughout his book, which is this idea that what does it mean to have the image, to be in the image of God? It doesn't mean that God has a shape, but it means that we have this divine intellect that we're talking about, which allows us to apprehend God, which allows us to come to some of these mysteries. And I'm not convinced that using his methodology for getting there will get many people here to the same place, or will get many people in our modern world to the same place, because he's working in such a specific culture, a specific way of thinking. It feels like a very long road to get there. But to me, his ideas are what are most revolutionary, and can lead us to get there from a slightly different way. And if we went to such detail into all parts of every chapter, I feel we'd just be here literally for years. So it's not quite my intention. So I want to take us now to one more place, which is Moses de Narbonne, which I brought about when we were talking about the commentaries a few sessions ago. And so Moses de Narbonne, who is, in some ways writes the early definitive commentary. He's the philosopher of his day. I like ending with him also because he's from Perpignan, which is where I grew up in France. But he's also giving us the idea why this is so important to Maimonides. And actually, I'll give you a sense really of what I'm working with here too. I think it's interesting. So, you know, a lot of things in our modern day you can find on the internet, right? You think I can just find that on the internet and you'll find everything. But some of this stuff you cannot find on the internet so easily. because it's only in manuscript form. So I just wanted to give you a sense of working with Moses de Narbonne, what I'm working with. So this is, I found this, took me hours, but I found a text by More HaMore, the guide to the guide, which is written by the last time we had a commentary in the guide was by Solomon of Maimon, who has lived in the 1800s. And he included here on the upper left some of the commentary of Moses de Narbonne, known as the Norbani. And so if I don't care about the guide to the guide, his commentary is really getting into the weeds, and it's endless. You can see it's written in Rashi script. That's the way the script is. But the Norbani, he writes these little clear ideas of what we're talking about. So that's what one of the things I'm using in my preparation for this. Because Moses de Narbonne is coming right after Maimonides, a little bit after Maimonides, and he is the most important commentary probably throughout the ages. So this is what he
From his text.
On the guide.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is what he says. This is at least my understanding of what he's saying, because it's a little bit dense, but somebody like to read for us, Moses de Narbonne.
Yeah, I'll read.
Okay.
The first chapter, Solemn, Maimonides, starts with this issue because human beings are the tachlis, the central matter, the goal, the first thing in thought and the last in deed. Human beings, include all of the different parts of physicality, because the greatest of the prophets also began with it in the Mesech Bereshit, the account of creation. The issue in which is the essence of the idea is that matter is not whole. This one is not on his own like the matter he is connected to. There are things that are demanded of him to bring the spirit down into the world. Okay. What is Narbonne saying about what Maimonides is trying to do?
So right. So what is Narbonne saying? What is he saying? He is saying that why is it starting with Selem? Because human beings are the central part of the universe, right? We saw that, right? Human beings have this dominion over the world. And the core understanding of a human being is that we have everything is included within us. I was thinking about this earlier, and in some degree it's true, right? We have the reptile brain, and we have the this, and we have the that. We include all of it. And the idea that there's a part of us that's physical and a part of us that's spiritual is what or spirit or intellect for Maimonides, this intellect is, right, matter is not whole, but we have something that's demanded of us, which is to bring spirit down into the world. This is the word, ruchaniyut is the word for spirituality is what we call it now, but he's talking about spirit. And so human beings, we have this intellect to apprehend, and the intellect is used to eventually apprehend mystical truths or spiritual truths or just metaphysical truths, however you want to call them. And that's central to why we were created and what it means to be a human being. And that's why Maimonides starts with this idea of image, because for the Narbonne, because we're in the image of God, we have this duty to use our intellectual apprehension to go into these metaphysical truths.
Why don't they use the word nefesh or soul or something like that?
What do you mean?
They didn't.
They didn't. Okay. But isn't that implicit that one is trying to develop their soul?
Explain that more. Say more.
Well, there's kind of like a non-physical part of our being, of who we are, our essence, our there's the physicality part, and then there's the part that has to do with our personality and our being and our connectedness to others, and our connectedness to God. And that's not, and to the world, and to other beings.
Yeah. So, and I think when Narboni is interpreting this, and the whole idea is that we have a soul, and that's implicit. And part of having that soul is not matter, it's not connected to matter. And that means that so part of us is matter, but we're not, our soul is not connected to that matter. But the more than that part of us that is what we call soul, is what gives us that that intellect that Maimonides closes the chapters with, which gives us the ability to bring the spirit into the world. And then that's kind of already embodied within creation itself. Mike, does that answer?
Yeah. Mhm. That's where I was going. And I like the idea that they're using tachlis, that we need to get to the essence of the issue. What's the important thing?
And that's why I included tachlis, because I thought, tachlis is the word we still use. So it's fun when you come upon this ancient manuscript and the Narboni is still using the word tachlis in the same way we use tachlis. Let's get to the tachlis.
And he's using it in the same way.
Yeah, and he's using it in the same way. It's one of the wonders of the Jewish tradition is that here you are, thousands of years separated from people, and you can read in the original what they're saying, and you're speaking a close enough language to what they're speaking to decipher it. It's really quite incredible, and it really gives you a window into what they're thinking and what's going on. As far as I know, this text, Moses de Narbonne, what I just that's never ever been translated to English, along with hundreds of thousands of other books and documents through the ages that haven't been translated into English. But in their time were, bestsellers. They sold at least 100 copies. But were really popular at the time. So he's coming to what is the central idea of what Maimonides is trying to do. And Maimonides is telling us about laying the foundation to what's so important is that we're made in the image of God, means we have this ability through our intellect to apprehend God. And that's the focus. Go ahead. Phil, I thought you were about to say something. No. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. So nice to see everyone. We'll continue next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Have a great
everyone.
day. Thanks.
Bye.
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 The readings are very helpful.
Yeah, I think so too.
We'll talk later.